The penthouse library fell into a suffocating silence as 6-year-old Ajoa stood before four of Seoul's most ruthless men. Her small, dark hands were clasped tightly against the vibrant cotton of her patterned dress, a stark splash of color against the cold, gray marble of the room. Her benefactor, Kim Young-kwang, a man whose whisper could collapse the Kospi and whose shadow governed the dark alleys of Itaewon, had just done the unthinkable. He had placed a single, battered envelope on the glass table and looked past his own flesh and blood. He wasn't looking at his sons, who smelled of expensive cologne in desperation. He was looking at the child of the woman who cleaned their floors. Sungmin, Sunghoon, Sungki, and Sungho sat like statues in their $10,000 suits, their smiles tight and their eyes flickering with a hunger they couldn't hide. 4 years they had invaded this house with legal documents and false promises of loyalty, promises that tasted like ash. But Ajoa's gaze kept drifting past their angry glares, past the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Han River, toward the shadows where her mother stood. There stood Nana Ya, clutching a damp cloth, her eyes glistening with a terror she was trying desperately to mask. She was the woman who sang Chui lullabies that sounded like a warm breeze, who had served this family with a dignity they didn't deserve. What none of these greedy men knew, what would eventually shatter their pride and expose the rot in their souls, was that this wasn't just about an inheritance. This was about a dying lion's last roar. It was about a father who had spent months secretly testing the spirits of his heirs, only to find them empty. It was about a lost envelope that held the keys to $1 billion empire, an envelope the sons had stepped over, but a little girl had picked up simply because grandfather looked tired. This is the story of how bloodline failed, how a hidden moral trap was sprung in the heart of a criminal dynasty, and how the person they all underestimated became the only one powerful enough to inherit the throne. Stay tuned as you see how this high-stake drama unfolds. Don't forget to like and subscribe. 2 weeks earlier, Kim Young-kwang had gathered his sons in this very study, the room where he had ordered and brokered deals that moved mountains, and told them something that made their pulses spike with greed. My legacy will not be divided by birthright, but by character. You have 1 week, live in this house. Show me who deserves to hold the keys when I am gone. Sung-ho had smirked first, the eldest son whose ego was built on a foundation of debt and shadows. He adjusted his silk tie, his manicured fingers drumming against the leather chair, already imagining the maid and her daughter being thrown into the street. He didn't realize he was already walking into a grave of his own making. The grandfather clock in the corner of the library ticked with the rhythmic precision of a heartbeat, the only sound in a room where 5 men were holding their breath. Kim Young-kwang sat at the head of the mahogany table, his silhouette framed by the cold, blue expanse of the Seoul skyline. In front of him lay the single, cream-colored envelope, its edges crisp and its presence heavier than the gold bars locked in the vaults below. I have spent 70 years building an empire out of ash and bone, Young-kwang began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate the very glass of the table. And for 30 of those years, I have watched my own blood wait for me to become ash again, so they could pick over the remains. Sungmin, the eldest, adjusted his glasses, his face a mask of practiced corporate neutrality. Father, we are only here because we care about the transition. The markets are volatile. We need stability. Stability, Young-kwang repeated, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. Is that what you call the secret offshore accounts you've been opening in Singapore, Sungmin? Or perhaps the way Sung-hoon has been selling off our logistics shares to our rivals to cover his baccarat debts. The silence returned, sharper this time. Sung-hoon flinched, his manicured hands clenching into fists beneath the table. The brothers shifted, the air thick with the scent of expensive wool and the sudden, metallic tang of fear. They weren't just being summoned, they were being dissected. Standing near the heavy oak doors, Nanaya kept her head bowed, her fingers twisting the edge of her cleaning apron. Beside her, Ajoa stood perfectly still. The little girl's eyes were large and dark, reflecting the city lights like two quiet moons. She didn't look at the men or the opulence of the room. She looked only at the old man at the head of the table. To the brothers, he was a god of capital. To her, he was just the man who looked tired and always smelled of old paper and peppermint. "The envelope," young Kwang said, tapping the paper with a gnarled finger. "Inside are the controlling codes for the Sterling Trust. It is the heart of the Kim legacy. Whoever holds this, holds the others. It was left in the library 3 months ago. I left it there, unprotected, for 3 days." He looked at Sung-ki and Sung-ho, the younger sons who had spent those 3 months trying to outdo each other in loyalty. "Sung-ki, you walked past this table 12 times that week. You even moved the envelope once to set down your scotch. You saw the seal. You knew what it was, but you didn't touch it, not because you were honest, but because you were afraid I was watching. You chose cowardice over character." Young Kwang then turned his gaze to the doorway. And yet, when the room was empty and the cameras were supposedly off, someone did pick it up. The 4 brothers turned as one, their eyes landing on Ajoa with a ferocity that made Nana instinctively step forward, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. "What is this, father?" Sung-ho demanded, standing up, his voice cracking with indignation. "Are you suggesting a child, a servant's child, is part of our succession? This is a family meeting. Send them out. She is already more part of this family's future than you realize," young Kwang said softly. He beckoned Ajoa forward. The little girl didn't hesitate. She walked toward the man who terrified the underworld, her footsteps silent on the silk rug. When she reached the table, young Kwang didn't hand her the envelope. He simply looked at his sons. When she found this, she didn't look for a lawyer. She didn't look for a shredder. She brought it to her mother and asked if the tired grandfather had lost his heart because she thought the papers looked important to his health. He picked up the envelope, the seal glinting under the chandelier. "You 4 looked for power. She looked for me. Today, the search ends." Kim Young-kwang leaned back into the shadows of his high-backed chair, his eyes tracking the way his sons reacted to Ajoa's presence at the table. To the world, these men were the titans of the Kim legacy, but in this light, stripped of their PR teams and boardroom shields, their true hungers began to leak through their expensive veneers. Sung-min, the eldest, was the first to regain his composure, though the vein in his temple throbbed with a frantic rhythm. His hunger was for order, a desperate, clinical need to categorize the world so he could control it. He looked at the envelope not as a gift, but as a ledger out of balance. To him, Ajoa's honesty wasn't a virtue, it was a glitch in the system. He had spent his life calculating the exact moment he would step into his father's shoes, measuring his worth in stock buybacks and hostile takeovers. To see a child who couldn't even read a balance sheet standing near the heart of the trust felt like a personal insult to his intellect. Next to him, Sung-hoon's leg bounced with a nervous energy that his silk trousers couldn't hide. His hunger was more visceral, the hunger of the void. He was the son who burned through wealth to feel alive, haunting the high-limit rooms of Macau and the underground racing circuits of Gangnam. He didn't want the empire to build. He wanted it to spend. His eyes darted from the envelope to his father's frail hands, calculating how many months of reckless living were contained within that cream-colored paper. To him, Nana Ya and her daughter were merely obstacles, static in the signal of his impending freedom. He viewed the maid with a localized cruelty, his lip curling as if her very presence in the room polluted the air he intended to own. In the center sat Sung Ki, the silent observer. His hunger was for the throne itself, not for the money or the order, but for the sheer weight of the crown. He was the most like his father in temperament, cold, patient, and observant, but he lacked the one thing young Kwang valued most, a soul. Sung Ki had spent the last 3 months playing the role of the devoted son, bringing tea he never poured and asking about health he hoped was failing. He looked at Ajoa with a terrifyingly blank expression. He wasn't angry. He was reevaluating. He was already wondering if the girl could be used as a pawn, or if the maid had some leverage he hadn't yet uncovered. His greed was a quiet, architectural thing, building a prison for anyone who stood in his way. Then there was Sung Ho, the youngest, whose hunger was the loudest and the most fragile. He was the son who shouted to prove he existed. "This is a joke," he snapped, his voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling glass. "You're using a servant's child to lecture us. We are the ones who carry the name, Father. We are the ones who will be at the funeral while she's back in the kitchen." His hunger was for validation, a scream for a father's love that he had tried to buy with grand gestures and loud successes, never realizing that young Kwang only responded to whispers. Young Kwang watched them all, a bitter disappointment settling in his chest like lead. He saw the 4 hungers, the accountant, the gambler, the usurper, and the loudmouth, and realized that none of them had noticed the way Ajoa was still holding the edge of the table, her knuckles white, not out of greed for the paper, but out of fear for the tired grandfather who looked like he was fading before her eyes. "You see the paper," young Kwang said, his voice dropping to a whisper that commanded more attention than Sung Ho's shout. "But you still haven't asked what the girl saw when she picked it up. You haven't asked why she didn't open it." He looked at Nana Ya, who remained a shadow against the wall, her dignity a silent rebuke to the 4 men in suits. The test was no longer about a lost envelope. It was about which of his sons would be the first to realize that the most valuable thing in the room wasn't on the table, but standing right beside it. The tension in the room shifted from a heavy, suffocating pressure into a sharp, jagged edge. Sung Min was the first to break the silence, his voice tight with a frustration that bordered on panic. "Father, this has gone far enough," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the corner of the room. "We have indulged this theater because we respect your process, but bringing the domestic staff into a conversation regarding the Sterling Trust is more than an insult, it's a security risk." Young Kwang didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the city lights as if he were reading a map of a kingdom he had already decided to burn. Sung Ho, sensing his brother's lead, stood up fully this time. He was the youngest, and his entitlement was a loud, unrefined thing. He turned his glare toward Nana Ya, who stood like a statue by the wall. "You," he barked, his finger trembling as he pointed at her. "Take your daughter and get out. Now. This isn't a nursery, and it certainly isn't a soup kitchen. How dare you let her touch that table?" Nana Ya's fingers tightened on Ajoa's shoulder, a silent, protective instinct. She didn't speak. She had learned long ago that in this house, words were weapons she wasn't allowed to carry. But Ajoa didn't shrink away. She looked up at Sung-ho, her expression one of quiet, heartbreaking confusion. To her, the man in the expensive suit wasn't a master. He was just someone making a lot of noise while the tired grandfather was trying to rest. "It's a simple question, father," Sung-hoon added, his voice dripping with a casual cruelty that was far more chilling than Sung-ho's shouting. "Why is she here? If you want to teach us a lesson about honesty, use a parable. Don't use the help. It creates expectations. Does she think she's earned a tip for picking up a piece of trash?" The word trash hung in the air like a foul odor. Kim Young-kwang finally turned his head, his gaze sweeping over his 4 sons with a coldness that silenced the room. "You call it trash," he said softly. "You call her the help. You see a woman who cleans your spills and a child who walks softly, and you think they are invisible. You think they are part of the furniture." He leaned forward, the light from the chandelier catching the deep lines of his face. "But while you were busy auditing my accounts to see how much you could steal when I die, Nana Ya was auditing my pulse. While you were planning which of your brothers to betray first, this child was picking up the trash you were too arrogant to notice. You ask why she is here. She is here because she is the only person in this room who isn't currently calculating the cost of my casket." Sung-ki, the silent one, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Father, sincerity is a luxury for those who don't have to run a conglomerate. We are businessmen. We are your heirs. You cannot compare our greed to a child's lack of understanding. She didn't open the envelope because she doesn't know what it is. That isn't character. That's just ignorance." "Is it?" Young Kwang's voice was like a whip. "Then why did you ignore it, Sung-ki? You knew exactly what it was. You were so smart that you assumed it was a trap. You were so sophisticated that you couldn't imagine a world where something valuable is simply returned because it belongs to someone else." He looked back at Ajoa and offered a small, rare nod. "The maid is here because she is the mirror I am holding up to your faces. And judging by how much you want her to leave, I suspect you don't like what you see." The sons looked at each other, a dark realization beginning to dawn. This wasn't just a lecture. It was an eviction of their assumptions. And as Ajoa reached out to steady the old man's shaking hand, the brothers realized that for the first time in their lives, they were the ones standing on the outside, looking in. Kim Young-kwang stood up from the table, his movements slow and deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who had outlived his enemies but was losing the battle against his own legacy. He walked toward the wall where a series of sleek, dark panels were embedded into the mahogany. With a single touch, the panels hummed to life, revealing 4 high-definition screens that had been recording the silent history of the penthouse for months. The brothers froze. The air in the room, already thin, seemed to vanish entirely as the first video began to play. It wasn't a recording of a heist or a grand betrayal. It was a Tuesday afternoon in January. The screen showed the library, empty except for Kim Young-kwang, who had staged a deliberate moment of vulnerability. He was seen slumped in his chair, a glass of water shattered on the floor at his feet, his hand clutching his chest in a feigned tremor of pain. On the screen, Sung-min entered the room. He saw his father struggling. He stopped, his hand going to his phone, not to call an ambulance, but to check the time. He stood there for 30 seconds, watching his father gasp, his face calculating the precise delay between a stroke and a signature. He had waited to see if the end was coming before deciding if it was worth his breath to help. Eventually, he had simply turned around and walked out, closing the door softly so no one would know he had been there. "You looked for a pulse, Sung-min," The old man whispered in the present, not looking at his son, but only to see if it had stopped. The next screen flickered. It was a rainy evening. Sung-hoon was shown stumbling into the kitchen, smelling of smoke and desperation. He found Nanaya cleaning the counters. The audio was crystal clear. He had demanded she open the private safe in the pantry, and when she refused, he had spat on her shoes, calling her a parasite that had latched onto his father's senility. Through the grain of the footage, Nana Ya's face remained a mask of stoicism, but her hands were shaking. In the library, Sung-hoon turned a deep shade of crimson, unable to look at the woman he had treated like a ghost. Screen after screen, the test nobody saw continued. It wasn't about the envelope on the table, that was merely the final bait. The true test had been the thousand small moments of perceived invisibility. It was the way Sung-ki had mocked the estate's security staff when he thought the patriarch was asleep. It was the way Sung-ho had kicked Ajoa's favorite doll into the fireplace during a fit of rage over a bad investment. "You thought the throne was won in the boardroom," Young Kwang said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. "You thought power was about who could scream the loudest or lie the best. But I didn't build this empire with lies. I built it with loyalty. And for 3 months, I watched you treat the people who serve me like dirt beneath your heels." He turned to the final screen. It showed a quiet moment from a week ago. Young Kwang had left his expensive gold watch on the edge of the fountain in the foyer. The brothers had all walked past it. Sung-ki had even nudged it closer to them, hoping it would fall and break, so he could offer to buy a more expensive one to show off his wealth. But then Ajo appeared. She picked up the watch, wiped the moisture from the glass with her sleeve, and took it to the kitchen. She didn't hide it. She didn't sell it. She stood on her tiptoes to put it on the high shelf where she knew the grandfather kept his daily vitamins. Young Kwang turned off the screens, the library falling back into a blue neon darkness. "The envelope was a test of your greed," he said, looking at the 4 men who were now sweating in their tailored suits. "But the cameras were a test of your souls. And while you were busy failing, a 6-year-old was the only person in this house who acted like a Kim." The atmosphere in the library grew heavy, the air cooling as the neon glow of the Seoul skyline cast long, jagged shadows across the mahogany table. Kim Young Kwang did not return to his seat. Instead, he stood by the window, his reflection ghostly against the glass, looking out over the city he had conquered while his sons scrambled to reclaim their dignity in the wreckage of his revelation. "The screens show your hearts," Young Kwang said, his voice barely a whisper yet filling every corner of the room. "But the envelope was a test of your future. And yet, when I asked for it this morning, none of you could produce it." Sungmin cleared his throat, his posture stiff. "Father, we assumed it was part of a broader legal filing. We didn't want to interfere with what we thought was a controlled security protocol. You didn't interfere because you didn't have it," the old man countered, turning slowly. He looked at Sung-ho, whose face was still flushed with the heat of his earlier outburst. "You looked for it, didn't you, Sung-ho? I saw the desk in my private study. The locks were scratched. Someone had been digging for the sterling trust codes like a dog looking for a bone." Sung-ho looked away, his silence an admission of guilt. The brothers began to eye each other with newfound suspicion. If none of them had the envelope, and they were the only ones who knew its value, the logic dictated that one of them was lying to the rest. The unity of their greed was beginning to fracture, replaced by a frantic, internal war of accusations. "I didn't take it," Sung-hoon muttered, his eyes darting to Sung-ki. "But I saw you coming out of the library at 3 a.m. on Wednesday. You had something tucked under your jacket." "I was getting a book," Sung-ki replied coldly, his mask of stoicism finally showing a hairline crack. "Unlike you, I don't need to steal from my father to pay off a casino." The bickering escalated, a cacophony of elite voices rising in a desperate attempt to shift the blame. They were so consumed by their own theater that they failed to notice Ajoa step forward. She looked at the men, then at her mother, and finally at the tired grandfather, who looked as though he were carrying the weight of the entire world on his narrow shoulders. Quietly, without a word, Ajoa reached into the hidden pocket of her vibrant cotton dress. She pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. The seal was unbroken, the wax still bearing the intricate crest of the Kim family. It was pristine, untouched by the sweat of greed or the frantic tearing of desperate hands. The room went deathly silent. The brothers stared at the paper as if it were a live grenade. Ajoa walked to the table and placed the envelope exactly where it had sat 3 months ago. She didn't look at the brothers. She looked at Young Kwang. "Grandfather," she said, her voice small but remarkably steady, "you left this near the window where the rain comes in. I didn't want the ink to run. Mama said important things should be kept dry." Nana stood by the wall, her breath hitched in her throat. She hadn't known Ajoa was holding it. She had only known her daughter had been uncommonly protective of her treasures lately. Young Kwang looked down at the envelope, then at the girl. A single, sharp laugh escaped his lips, a sound of pure, bitter irony. 3 months, he mused, picking up the file. For 3 months, the keys to my kingdom were sitting in a child's toy box, tucked between a doll and a drawing of a sun. And my sons, the giants of industry, were tearing my house apart looking for it, never thinking to ask the only person who cared enough to keep it safe. He turned back to his sons, his eyes like flint. "You looked for wealth, and you found nothing. She looked for a memory, and she found everything. You keep asking why the maid is here. She is here to witness the moment I realize that blood doesn't make a legacy. It only makes an inheritance. And none of you are heirs anymore." The silence that followed Ajoa's revelation was different from the previous ones. It wasn't the heavy pressure of a threat, but the hollow, echoing vacuum of a world being upended. The 4 brothers stared at the cream-colored envelope on the table as if it were a strange relic from a civilization they didn't recognize. To them, those pages represented the sterling trust, a fortress of offshore accounts, controlling shares, and the absolute power to dictate the lives of thousands. To them, the envelope was a weapon. But as Kim Young Kwang looked at the little girl standing by his side, he saw a truth that made his billion-dollar empire look like a pile of dry leaves. "You said it was a gift, grandfather," Ajoa whispered, her voice cutting through the clinical chill of the penthouse. She didn't look at the brothers' reddening faces or their clenched jaws. She looked only at the old man's tired eyes. "Mama said gifts are for people you love. I thought maybe you were sad because you lost it." Young Kwang reached out, his gnarled hand trembling slightly as he touched the edge of the envelope. "And do you know what is inside this, Ajoa?" She shook her head, the braids of her hair swaying gently. "Just paper, heavy paper." A choked, bitter sound escaped from Sung-ho. "Heavy paper," he spat, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and mounting rage. "That heavy paper is the reason we have a name in this city. It's the reason you have a roof over your head, child. It's the blood of our family, and you're treating it like a lost library book." "Silence!" Young Kwang's voice didn't rise in volume, but it carried the weight of a falling blade. He turned his gaze to his youngest son. She treats it like paper because she is the only one here who isn't a slave to it. You foresee the gold, but you've forgotten how to see the person holding it. He turned back to Ajoa. Ajoa, if I told you that this paper could buy you 100 houses, or 1,000 toys, or make everyone in this room bow to you, would you have kept it then? Ajoa tilted her head, a look of genuine confusion crossing her face. The concept of wealth as a tool for dominance was as foreign to her as the cold calculations of the men in suits. "But I already have a bed," she said softly. "And Mama says if everyone bows, they can't see the sky. I just wanted you to stop looking so sad." The emotional impact of her words hit the room like a physical blow. For the brothers, the world was a zero-sum game of acquisition and loss. For Ajoa, the world was a collection of people, some who sang lullabies, and some who looked like they were carrying stones in their chests. Her innocence wasn't a lack of intelligence. It was a refusal to participate in the corruption that had rotted her elders' hearts. Nanaya stood in the shadows, her eyes brimming with tears. She had spent years teaching her daughter that the greatest wealth was a clean spirit, never imagining that such a lesson would one day become a death sentence for the ambitions of the most powerful men in Seoul. Young Kwang picked up the envelope and held it out to Ajoa, his eyes searching hers. "Your brothers think you are a thief because they can only imagine stealing. They think you are a fool because they can only imagine greed. But you, Ajoa, you are the only one who saw a man where they saw a bank." He looked at his sons, his expression settling into a mask of finality. "You spent 30 years learning how to value wealth. Perhaps you should have spent 5 minutes learning how to understand it. Because while you were waiting for me to die so you could inherit my money, this child was waiting for me to live so she could return my heart." The brothers looked at the little girl, and for the first time, the anger in their eyes was eclipsed by a terrifying realization. They were no longer the protagonists of their father's story. They were merely the audience to their own undoing. The room, once a fortress of sterile elegance, began to fracture under the weight of the brothers' desperation. The realization that their father's gaze had shifted entirely away from them onto a child who didn't even know the currency of their world was a poison that traveled through their veins. The polished composure that had sustained the Kim dynasty for decades finally dissolved into a raw, ugly chaos. Sung-ho was the first to fully unravel. He lunged toward the table, his hand trembling as he reached for the cream-colored envelope, but Kim Young-kwang's shadow seemed to lengthen, pinning him in place. "This is a setup!" Sung-ho screamed, his voice cracking, shedding the last of his carefully cultivated Seoul elite accent. "You've gone senile, father. You're letting a servant's daughter play with the keys to our lives because she's cute? Because she brought you a piece of paper you dropped? I've spent my life being your son. Being my son." Young Kwang's voice was a low, rhythmic thrum. "You've spent your life being a debt I've had to pay. You didn't want a father, you wanted a benefactor." Sung-hoon let out a jagged, hysterical laugh, his eyes bloodshot. He turned on Sung-min, his older brother, his face twisted with a predatory glee. "And you, the great accountant. You knew, didn't you? You saw her in the library. You saw her picking up the trash, and you said nothing because you thought it was beneath your notice. Your order has cost us everything, brother. While you were counting the coins, the child took the vault." Sung-min didn't look at him. His face was a ghastly shade of gray, his eyes fixed on the footage still glowing on the wall, the image of himself standing over his father's feigned stroke, waiting for the clock to tick. The clinical, cold logic he had lived by had finally turned into a mirror, and the reflection was a monster. "I did what was necessary for the firm," he whispered, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "I was protecting the interests." "The only interest you protected was your own seat at the head of the table," Sung Ki interjected, his voice surprisingly calm, though it was the calmness of a man watching his own execution. He looked at Ajoa, then at Nana Ya, his gaze searching for some flaw, some hidden conspiracy they must have woven. "But even I didn't see this. I underestimated the depth of your resentment, Father. You didn't just want to test us. You wanted to humiliate us. I wanted to see if there was anything left to save," Young Kwang replied, looking at the 4 men who shared his blood but none of his spirit. "But as you stand here, screaming at each other like vultures over a carcass, you've given me my answer. You are not heirs. You are merely accidents of birth." The brothers began to turn on each other with a savagery that was almost physical. Accusations flew like shrapnel, secret debts exposed, past betrayals dragged into the light, and the long-simmering resentments of 4 men who had never been taught how to love, only how to win. They pointed fingers, their faces contorted with a spectrum of absolute rage and shock, exactly as the city lights outside began to flicker, as if the very power of the building was being drained by their toxicity. Ajoa took a step back, her small hand finding Nana Ya's. The shouting was a wall of noise she couldn't climb. She didn't understand why the heavy paper made them so loud, or why they looked at her as if she were a ghost. She looked up at her mother, who stood with her jaws set, her eyes reflecting a quiet, sorrowful strength. "They are loud because they are empty," Nana Ya whispered to her daughter, her voice a soft anchor in the storm. In that moment, the hierarchy of the room was permanently inverted. The 4 titans of industry had collapsed into small, bickering children, while the little girl in the cotton dress and the woman in the gray uniform stood with the quiet authority of those who had nothing to lose and everything to keep. The air in the library, once thick with the brothers' vitriol, suddenly grew thin as Kim Young Kwang did the unthinkable. He didn't just hold the envelope, he extended it toward Nana Ya. The movement was slow, heavy with the weight of a billion-dollar scepter, yet his hands were steadier than they had been all night. The 4 sons froze, their faces a distorted spectrum of shock and white-hot fury as they watched the keys to their kingdom being offered to the woman who had spent the last 7 years cleaning their spilled wine. "This estate," Young Kwang said, his voice a low, echoing bell, "requires a guardian who understands that a foundation is built on service, not greed. Nana Ya, you have been the only person in this house to treat my home as a sanctuary rather than a counting house. Ajoa has your heart. For that reason, I am placing the controlling interest of the Sterling Trust in your hands as her trustee." The silence that followed was visceral. Sung Min's jaw tightened until his teeth audibly ground together, and Sung Ho let out a choked, strangled sound of protest. But the greatest shock didn't come from the disinherited sons. It came from the maid herself. Nana yet did not reach for the cream-colored envelope. Instead, she tucked her hands behind her back, her fingers intertwining in a gesture of quiet, unyielding humility. She stood taller than any man in the room, her eyes meeting Young Kwang's with a clarity that made the billionaire blink. "No, sir," she said. Her voice was soft, carrying the melodic lilt of her Ghanaian home, but it possessed a tectonic strength. "We did not come to this country to take what belongs to another man's blood, and my daughter did not return that paper to buy a throne. She did it because she saw a grandfather who was hurting." Young Kwang's hand faltered the envelope hovering in the empty space between them. Nana, do you understand what you are saying? This is security. This is power. This is a life where your daughter never has to bow to people like these again. He gestured vaguely at his sons, who looked like statues of frozen rage. Power that is given out of spite is just another kind of cage, Nana replied, her gaze briefly flickering to the four brothers with a look of profound pity. I have watched these men grow into ghosts because of that paper. I will not let my Ajoa become a ghost, too. We have our dignity, sir. We have our peace. That is a wealth your sons cannot touch, and it is a wealth I will not trade for a title. A jagged, hysterical laugh erupted from Sung-hoon. You hear that, father? Even the help doesn't want your scrap. She's playing you. It's a trick to get more. Nana didn't even turn her head. She looked only at Ajoa, who was watching her mother with wide, adoring eyes. Ajoa didn't know what a trustee was, but she knew that her mother's voice sounded like the truth. Young Kwang felt a stinging sensation in his chest, not the phantom pain of his feigned stroke, but the sharp, clean burn of genuine respect. For 70 years, he had believed that every person had a price, that every soul could be bought if the ink was dark enough and the numbers were long enough. In his final hour, a woman who owned nothing had just proven him wrong. "You refuse," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Not because you are afraid, but because you are better than the gift." "I do not refuse out of pride, sir," she said, finally reaching out to touch the old man's arm, her hand warm and grounding. "I refuse because Ajoa's heart is worth more than your empire. Keep your money. Just give her the memory of a grandfather who chose to be kind at the end." The sons were speechless, caught in a moral vacuum where their greed had no currency. They had spent their lives fighting for a prize that a maid had just looked at and found wanting. In that refusal, Nana hadn't just protected her daughter. She had delivered the final, devastating blow to the brothers' pride. She had shown them that the thing they would kill for was not even worth the peace of a humble woman's soul. The library fell into a silence so profound it felt like the very foundation of the Kim Empire had finally settled into the earth. Kim Young-kwon looked at Nana, his eyes misting with a realization that had eluded him through decades of power plays and blood wars. By refusing the gift, she had performed the final, most necessary part of the test. She had proven that she was the only one capable of protecting Ajoa from the very poison that had consumed his sons. "You refuse the burden because you love her," Young Kwang whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his thin lips. "And that is exactly why the law must bow to you." He turned back to the mahogany table and picked up a different pen. Not the heavy gold one he used for business, but a simple, worn fountain pen. With a steady hand, he opened the cream-colored envelope and signed the final addendum to the Sterling Trust. The four brothers surged forward, their faces contorted in a final, desperate hope that their father had regained his senses, but the old man's gaze was like a wall of ice. "Blood gave me heirs," he said, his voice regaining its former steel as he addressed the four men in their tailored suits. "But character gave me a legacy. You will each receive your controlled stipends, enough to live, but never enough to destroy. You are no longer the masters of this house. You are merely its guests." Sungmin gasped, the clinical mask of the accountant shattering into 1,000 pieces of grief. Sung-ho's face turned a bruised shade of purple, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream of entitlement. They looked at the paper, then at the little girl, and finally at each other, realizing that the hierarchy they had spent their lives climbing had been dismantled by a 6-year-old's honesty and a maid's refusal. The trust will be held in a blind foundation, Young Kwang continued, his eyes locked on Ajoa, managed by an independent board. But the final authority, the right to veto, the right to choose the path of his family's wealth, will rest with Ajoa when she comes of age. And until then, Nana Ya, you will not be the owner. You will be the conscience of the board. You will be paid not as a servant, but as a director, with the power to ensure this money is used to heal, not to hollow out souls. Nanaya bowed her head, not in submission, but in a quiet acceptance of a duty she had tried to avoid. She saw that this wasn't just about money. It was about the old man's soul seeking a way to be at peace. Young Kwang reached out and took Ajoa's small hand in his own. For the first time in the entire evening, the cold blue light of the Seoul skyline seemed to soften, turning into a warm, amber glow as the sun began to rise over the Han River. The tired grandfather didn't look tired anymore, he looked finished. "You return my heart, Ajoa," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of the waking city. "Now go with your mother. The air in this room is too heavy for a child who knows how to see the sky." As Nana led Ajoa toward the heavy oak doors, the four sons stood frozen in the center of the library, for shadows of men who had lost everything because they thought everything had a price. They watched the little girl in the colorful cotton dress walk out of their lives and into their future, her small hand tucked safely in her mother's. The Kim legacy had not ended with a bang or a boardroom coup. It had ended with a simple walk toward a doorway, leaving the greedy to their gold and the pure to their peace. Blood had not won the day. Truth had, and for the first time in 70 years, the house of Kim Young Kwang was finally quiet. The glass elevator ascended the side of the Sterling Tower, but Ajoa didn't look at the city she now partially owned. She looked at her reflection. At 24, she wore the mantle of the Kim legacy with a grace that silenced boardrooms, yet she still carried the small, faded peppermint tin that young Kwang had given her on his deathbed. She stepped out into the penthouse library. It had been 18 years since the suffocating silence of the inheritance test, but the room still smelled of old paper and peppermint. Waiting for her were 4 men. They were older now, their faces lined with the bitterness of a life lived on a leash. Sungmin, Sunghoon, Sungki, and Sungho sat in the same chairs they had occupied as young men. They were no longer titans. They were pensioners of a trust managed by the daughter of the woman they had once called the Help. "The quarterly reports are ready, Ajoa," Sungmin said, his voice devoid of its former clinical arrogance. He handed her a digital tablet with a slight tremor in his hand. Ajoa didn't take the tablet. Instead, she walked to the window, the same spot where the tired grandfather used to stand. "I didn't come for the reports, Sungmin," she said, her voice a calm, melodic echo of Nana Yas. "I came because I heard you try to fire the head of security yesterday because he didn't hold the elevator for you." The room went cold. Sungho shifted uncomfortably. "It was a matter of respect to Ajoa. We're still Kims." Ajoa turned, her gaze settling on them with a weight that made them look at their shoes. "You are Kims because of a name. He is a professional because of his character. If you ever confuse the two again, I will move your residence to the smallest apartment in the outskirts. Do I make myself clear?" They nodded in a jagged, collective motion. They had learned, through nearly 2 decades of controlled stipends and moral oversight, that Ajoa did not negotiate with ego. The doors opened, and Nanaya walked in. She no longer wore a gray uniform. She wore a flowing silk dress, her hair silvered like a crown. She didn't look like a director, though she held the title. She looked like a woman who had never lost her peace. "It is time, Ajoa," Nanaya said softly. Together, the mother and daughter walked to the mahogany table. Ajoa opened the peppermint tin and took out a single, yellowed envelope, the original one from the test. She placed it in the center of the table. "The lesson my grandfather taught us wasn't that money is evil," Ajoa said, looking at the four brothers. "It was that money is a magnifying glass. It only makes you more of what you already are. If you are greedy, it makes you a monster. If you are kind, it makes you a sanctuary." She reached out and touched the wood of the table. "He left everything to me not because I was smart, but because I was the only one who didn't want it. And as long as I lead this family, that will remain our only law." As Ajoa and Nanaya left the room to go to a charity gala for the foundation, the four brothers remained in the library. They were billionaires on paper, but as they sat in the gathering shadows of the penthouse, they finally understood the absolute poverty of their own souls. The little girl had grown up, and in doing so, she had ensured that while blood had given them a house, only character had built a home. The Kim legacy was finally, truly at rest. Like this video if the brothers' realization of their own absolute poverty of soul broke your heart. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that true inheritance isn't found in a bank account, but in the legacy of a person's character. Drop a comment telling me, if you were in Ajoa's shoes, would you have chosen the power of the empire or the peace of the tired grandfather? Your perspectives on what truly makes a family wealthy will determine how we explore the next chapter of the Kim legacy. Thank you for watching Afroseoul Love Diaries. Remember, for Ajoa and Nanaya, this wasn't just the end of a test. It was the beginning of a new law for their family. A law where blood might give you a house, but only character can build a home. Subscribe to this channel, because while the tired grandfather is at rest, the world is just starting to see what happens when a servant's child finally takes the throne.